First thing we're going to talk about is the state, and it's very important that you note how I wrote the word state. It is a lowercase s on purpose. The state is used to describe a dominant political unit. So when I'm using the term state, I'm talking about a country, the United States, Canada, Mexico. We're not talking about Indiana. And the reason being, the definition in the United States government, for our purposes, in order to be a state, you have to have 4 qualifications. Population, which Indiana and the United States have. Territory, we can look at a map and we can see defined borders of Indiana, we can find defined borders of the United States. We both have a government, but the thing that makes the United States a state as we are defining it and not Indiana is that the United States is a sovereign country. And sovereign just means sovereignty is a country's independent authority and right to govern itself. Indiana cannot go against the United States and the Constitution. And I'm going to hopefully get to this website. And this website is a list of different definitions of what a state or a sovereign country are. And it says how many countries are in the world. And the one that we're actually going to look at is this one right here. And it says there are 195 widely recognized sovereign states. In most situations, country is taken to refer to a sovereign nation state, and then it goes on, sovereignty, the idea that a country is completely and independently controlled by its own government. So for our purposes, we could go on through this whole entire list, and we could see that depending on how you define it, but we are going to use the smallest definition, and how the smallest definition is and it says here the most common way to count is internationally recognized sovereign states. And this is by counting how many members are part of the United Nations, which we will get to later. But that is an organization that all countries belong to and have some say over what's going on in the world, different policies on how we're going to react to different countries or different states. And so by definition, we are going to go with there are 195 states or countries throughout the world. There are 193 that are members of the United Nations, and then there are 2 states that are not members, but they are allowed to sit in on meetings, and those would be the Vatican City, which that is where the Pope lives. It is in Rome, which is in Italy, which makes Italy itself would be the state, but Vatican City is also a state. And then Palestine is the other one. So that's the 2 there, Vatican City and Palestine. So for our purposes, we're not going to go on and look at any more. We are going to say there are 195 states, which means they meet all 4 of those criteria. There are some theories of how the states, these 195 states came into being. The first one is force theory. So this would be kind of like a dictator or an individual who claims control over territory and then forces the population to submit. The state becomes sovereign then and has control of the government. The evolutionary theory takes place over a longer period of time, and these families eventually come together. The heads of these different families become a government, and then eventually these families settle on some territory, claim it as their own, and then they become sovereign states. The divine right theory, you should be familiar with this one. It's the monarchs, where you have kings and queens. And this theory states that God created the state. It made it sovereign. The government is made up of those who God chose to rule. And Queen Elizabeth II truly believes that God chose her family to rule, and then the population must obey their ruler. The social contract theory, this one is very, very important because this is what the model for the United States and how it came to being, and we're going to talk a lot more about the social contract theory. But basically what it says is a population in a given territory gave up much of its power to a government as needed to promote the well-being of all. So we create this sovereign state. John Locke, who's a natural rights philosopher, 1632 to 1704, and when we start talking about the Declaration of Independence, it was written in 1776. Years later, obviously, but Thomas Jefferson, you will find as you read the philosophies of John Locke and then look at the Declaration of Independence. Some people call the Declaration itself pure Locke because there's so much of his philosophies that are in that document. And I'm not going to read this, but take a few moments and read this for yourself. And we're going to break this down a little bit and see how Locke is reflected in the Declaration of Independence. The natural rights philosophy is based on imagining what life would be like if there were no government. And the term that John Locke used was a state of nature, where we're all wandering around, no rules, no regulations. And an example of this today would be the world. You have all of these sovereign countries, 195 of them, but is there anything sovereign over the world telling all of these countries collectively what it is they can and can't do? So basically these 195 countries operate in a state of nature. There is no superior power that acts as a government over all of these states. As a natural rights philosopher, they're going to ask the questions, these following questions, and base them on if there is no government. So the first question they would ask is, what is human nature? What traits of personality and character do all humans have in common? Are humans selfish, or do, for the most part, we all care for the good of others? They would ask themselves, what should the purpose of government actually be? Where does the government get its authority? How should government be organized? What kinds of government should be respected and supported? And they're going to ask what kinds of government should be resisted and fought. And we're going to look at these in much greater detail later. I just want to cover a few other things before we get started on some other things. But first we're going to look at what rights are. A right itself is a claim to have or obtain something or to act in a way that is justified on legal or moral grounds. Before John Locke, in the 1600s, before that period of time, rights were considered special privileges. We are familiar with rights today being things that everyone has access to, but back then, only a certain groups or classes of people had rights, and they were called exclusive rights. Natural rights philosophers completely disagreed with this. They thought that people's opportunities should not be limited by the situation or group in which they were born. The individual and not the group is the most important. It shouldn't matter what your socioeconomic level is when you are born. You should be able to rise to any level and not be held back by the group that you were born into. Life, liberty, and property, John Locke writes about. He says that these are the essence of humanity. They are what make us human beings and are inclusive rights that belong to everyone. And so when Thomas Jefferson writes in the Declaration about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he calls them unalienable rights. These are rights that belong to everyone and cannot be taken away or given up. And then we have two other rights here that work together to protect these natural rights. Civil rights, or this idea that we have freedom of conscience and privacy, and that protect us from unfair discrimination based on, it doesn't matter, your religion, your sex, your skin color. It shouldn't matter, that everyone should be treated exactly the same way. And then this idea of political rights, the right to vote or run for office. And so if everyone is participating in the political process and everyone has the freedom to speak their mind and not worry about being discrimination, these two work together to protect natural rights, and we'll find them in the Constitution when we look at it later. The social contract, like I said earlier, of the four theories, this is the one that we are most familiar with. Locke realized there would always be people who would try to violate our rights. So if we're operating in this state of nature, we need some sort of protection, or the strongest person is going to be able to take power. So the best way to solve this problem is for each individual to agree with others to create and live under a government and give it the power to make and enforce laws. thus creating a social contract. So in all contracts, to get something, you must give something up. So as individuals, we are going to give up our rights to live in this state of nature. We're going to give up our rights to do anything that we want to, and we are going to consent to obey the laws. And the other part of this is everyone receives the security that can be provided by the government. Security of knowing our rights are protected. So we give up our rights to do anything we want, and we get in exchange for that the protection and security from our government. So Thomas Jefferson writes, and John Locke writes, that the purpose of government is to protect our natural rights that the individual cannot effectively secure in a state of nature. And in the Declaration, he writes that to secure these rights, and he's talking about natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the government gets its power from the people, and the purpose of government is to secure our rights.